My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 27 years old. And 6 months ago, my father fired me from the family business in front of 30 employees, handed my office key to my younger brother, and told security to escort me out before I sabotage anything. 3 weeks ago, that same father stood outside my apartment at 11:40 at night in the pouring rain, begging me to come back before the company collapsed completely. But before I tell you why he was shaking so hard he could barely hold his phone, you need to understand what the Mercer family business actually was. And what my brother destroyed the second I walked away. If you've ever worked yourself to exhaustion just to watch someone else take credit for it, I want you to stay until the end of this story. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. These stories aren't just drama. Sometimes they remind people they're not crazy for finally choosing themselves. Now let me take you back to the summer I turned 14. Because that was the first time I realized my father already knew which son mattered more. My grandfather built Mercer Industrial Supply in 1978. Small warehouse. 2 forklifts. 1 loading dock that jammed every winter. By the time I was born, the company supplied construction materials to half the county. Roofing sheets. Concrete mix. Commercial piping. Fasteners. Safety equipment. My father, Daniel Mercer, inherited the business after Grandpa suffered a stroke. Dad liked to tell people he saved the company. What he never mentioned was that Grandpa had already built most of it before Dad ever touched the books. But in our house, facts shifted depending on who was talking. And my younger brother, Tyler, grew up believing Dad was some kind of business genius. Tyler was 2 years younger than me. Funny. Charismatic. The kind of person who could walk into a room and make strangers love him in 5 minutes. Dad adored that about him. At family dinners, Tyler talked. Dad listened. I worked. Dad expected it. That was the rhythm of our family. By 16, I was spending weekends at the warehouse instead of going out with friends. I learned inventory systems, vendor accounts, shipping schedules, payroll software. At 17, I was waking up at 4:30 in the morning to help unload trucks before school. Dad called it building character. Tyler called it Ethan being weird again. Everyone laughed. Including Mom. At the time, I laughed too. That's the thing about emotional neglect. If it happens slowly enough, you start treating it like normal weather. The warehouse smelled like sawdust and diesel fuel. Every morning, old country music played through a radio near the loading dock while the forklift batteries charged beside the wall. That place became my entire world. And eventually, the company quietly became mine too. Not legally. Not publicly. But operationally? Absolutely. By 23, I had redesigned the inventory system after noticing nearly $180,000 in annual losses from ordering mistakes. I automated vendor tracking, negotiated new shipping contracts, created digital forecasting spreadsheets Dad still didn't fully understand. Revenue increased 31% in 2 years. Dad accepted every compliment from clients personally. He never once mentioned my name. And honestly, that still wasn't the part that hurt most. The part that hurt most was what happened the night Mom handed Tyler the promotion I'd already earned. But before I tell you about that dinner, I need to explain something important about my brother. Tyler didn't hate me. That would have been easier. Tyler just floated through life believing everything would always work out for him because it always had. If he missed deadlines, someone fixed them. If he forgot orders, warehouse staff covered for him. If he overspent company money entertaining clients at bars downtown, Dad called it relationship building. Meanwhile, I once got lectured for ordering the wrong barcode printer because it cost $90 more than expected. That's how different the rules were for us. At 24, I practically lived inside that warehouse. I missed birthdays, skipped vacations, ended relationships. One girlfriend told me, "You talk about that company like it's your child." At the time, I thought she was exaggerating. Now I think she was warning me. The promotion dinner happened on a Thursday night in November. Mom cooked pot roast. Tyler showed up 40 minutes late wearing a designer jacket he definitely couldn't afford himself. Dad poured whiskey into crystal glasses Grandpa used to keep locked away for important moments. That should have been my first clue. Dad stood up smiling. To the future of Mercer Industrial. Then he slid a folder across the table toward Tyler. Vice President of Operations. My stomach dropped so fast it physically hurt. Tyler blinked. What? Dad laughed. You earned it, son. Earned it. I remember looking down at my hands because I genuinely thought if I looked at Dad directly, I might say something I couldn't take back. Mom finally glanced at me. We know this is disappointing, Ethan. Disappointing. Like I'd lost a raffle. Not spent 10 years carrying their company on my back. Dad leaned toward me. You're good with systems. Tyler's good with people. Leadership matters. Leadership. That word echoed in my head all night. Because Tyler had never once stayed late fixing inventory disasters. Never negotiated with angry suppliers. Never handled payroll during cash flow shortages. But he smiled well at client dinners. And apparently that mattered more than everything else. I should have walked away right then. Instead, I stayed. Because part of me still thought if I worked hard enough, eventually my father would see me. That was my mistake. 3 months later, Tyler approved a massive expansion deal with a contractor in Phoenix. Huge order. High risk. Dad loved it immediately because the revenue projections looked impressive on paper. I hated it the second I saw the numbers. The contractor had late payment history, weak credit backing, and inconsistent volume records. I told Dad privately the deal could destroy our liquidity if payments got delayed. He stared at me across his office desk for a long moment before saying something I still hear in my head sometimes. You always think too small. Then Tyler walked in smiling with signed contracts in his hand. Dad clapped him on the shoulder. That's what ambition looks like. I stopped arguing after that. Not because I agreed. Because I realized the decision had never been about logic. Dad wanted Tyler to become his successor so badly, he was willing to ignore reality to make it happen. And reality always sends a bill eventually. The collapse started quietly. Late invoices. Delayed shipments. Vendor complaints. Then payroll issues. Then equipment leases. Then panic. But before the company fully started breaking apart, my father made the biggest mistake of his life. He humiliated me publicly. And what happened afterward changed everything. It was a Monday morning in April. Rain hammered the warehouse roof so hard people were practically shouting over the noise. Dad called an emergency management meeting. Tyler sat beside him at the conference table trying to look confident. I already knew something was wrong because neither of them would make eye contact with me. Dad cleared his throat. We've had operational failures recently. Operational failures. Interesting phrase. Because Tyler had approved half the failed vendor contracts himself. Dad continued. After reviewing internal issues, we've decided leadership changes are necessary. Then he looked directly at me. My chest went cold. Ethan will no longer oversee operations effective immediately. Silence. One of the warehouse supervisors actually frowned in confusion. Dad kept talking. Tyler will assume full operational authority moving forward. I remember hearing the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. That's how quiet the room got. Then Dad said the sentence that destroyed whatever relationship we had left. We can't afford negativity during growth periods. Negativity. That's what he called every warning I'd given them for 6 months. Tyler wouldn't even look at me. Not once. Dad slid my office keys across the table. You should clear out your desk today. There are moments in life where your brain protects you by slowing everything down. I remember tiny details from that morning with terrifying clarity. The smell of burnt coffee. The scratch on the conference table near Dad's elbow. Rainwater dripping off somebody's boots onto the floor. And I remember realizing something horrifying. Nobody was shocked because nobody there believed this decision made sense. They were shocked because they knew exactly what would happen after I left. I packed my office in 20 minutes. Nobody stopped me. Not Dad. Not Tyler. Not Mom when she heard later. The only person who spoke was Lewis, our warehouse manager. He followed me outside carrying one of my boxes. Rain soaked through both our jackets. He looked genuinely sick. Ethan. He paused. You know this place doesn't run without you, right? I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because if I didn't laugh, I probably would have broken apart right there in the parking lot. That night I sat alone in my apartment eating gas station microwave food because I hadn't gone grocery shopping in 2 weeks. And for the first time since I was 16. I had nowhere to be the next morning. The silence felt wrong. But what happened 3 days later felt even worse. Because one of Mercer Industrial's biggest clients called me privately. And what he said changed everything. Before I continue, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been blamed for a disaster you tried to prevent? Because if you have, you already know how painful the next part of this story is going to be. 3 days after I got fired, my phone rang at 7:12 in the morning. It was Richard Holloway, owner of Holloway Construction, one of our oldest clients. He sounded nervous. Ethan, are you really gone? Yeah. Long silence. Then he lowered his voice. We pulled our account this morning. I sat upright immediately. What? Tyler promised delivery schedules your company physically can't meet. My stomach twisted. Richard continued. I figured you should know before this gets ugly. Ugly. That word ended up being an understatement. Within 6 weeks, 3 major clients left. 2 suppliers froze credit lines. Warehouse fulfillment errors tripled. Payroll bounced twice. And Tyler kept pretending everything was fine. Dad backed him publicly the entire time. Even after employees started quitting. Even after customer complaints exploded online. Even after the company lost nearly $900,000 in active contracts. But here's the part nobody saw coming. Including me. The systems I built. The forecasting tools. Vendor automations. Inventory algorithms. Client scheduling software. Most of them were tied to accounts registered under my administrative credentials. Not intentionally as revenge. That's just how they'd originally been created years earlier when nobody else understood how any of it worked. And once I was terminated, security access automatically revoked. At first the company tried working around it. Then everything started breaking. Inventory counts disappeared. Purchase forecasts failed. Shipment sequencing crashed. Tyler apparently told Dad it would take a weekend to rebuild everything manually. It took 6 weeks before they realized they couldn't. That's when the calls started. First Tyler. Then Mom. Then Dad. I ignored every single one. Not because I hated them. Because for the first time in my life, I wanted to know who I was without carrying their business on my shoulders. And honestly, that part surprised me most. I started sleeping normally again. Started cooking real meals. Started running in the mornings. I even took a consulting job with a logistics company in Denver. The CEO there listened when I spoke. That alone nearly broke me emotionally the first time it happened. Then came the twist I never expected. About 4 months after I left Mercer Industrial, Lewis called me late one night. His voice sounded shaken. Ethan, there's something you need to know about your father. I stepped onto my apartment balcony immediately. What happened? Long pause. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. Your dad mortgaged the warehouse 6 months before he fired you. Silence. Traffic moved below my apartment building while my entire understanding of the past year rearranged itself in real time. Lewis continued quietly. The company was already drowning before Tyler took over. That's when I finally understood the truth. Dad hadn't promoted Tyler because Tyler was better. Dad promoted him because admitting I was right about the expansion deal would have meant admitting he failed. And my father would rather destroy the company than let his favorite son look weak. That realization hurt more than getting fired ever did. Because suddenly every moment made sense. The rushed promotion. The public blame. The desperation. Dad needed a scapegoat. And I was the easiest one available. 6 months after I left Mercer Industrial, somebody knocked on my apartment door at 11:40 at night. Heavy rain hammered the windows. I opened the door expecting a neighbor. Instead, my father stood there soaked through completely. I barely recognized him. Dad looked older. Smaller somehow. Like the last half year had aged him 10 years. He held his phone so tightly his knuckles looked white. For a second neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "We're going under. Not the company. We." That was new. Dad looked past me into the apartment. I didn't know where else to go. And suddenly I saw it. Not the businessman. Not the intimidating father who controlled every room growing up. Just a terrified man watching his entire identity collapse. I let him inside. Rainwater pooled beneath his boots near the kitchen counter. Dad stared around my apartment awkwardly like he'd never actually imagined me having a life outside Mercer Industrial. Finally he sat down. And what he admitted next was the first honest thing he'd said to me in years. "I blamed you because I knew you were right." I didn't speak. Dad rubbed both hands across his face slowly. I thought Tyler would grow into the role. Silence. He didn't. That sentence sounded like it physically hurt him to say. Then Dad's voice cracked slightly. "The bank's taking the warehouse in 3 weeks." I looked down at the table because part of me still couldn't process hearing my father sound afraid. Not angry. Afraid. Then came the sentence I never thought I'd hear. "I need your help, son. Not the company's help. Mine." And honestly, part of me wanted to say no immediately. After everything. The humiliation. The betrayal. The years of being invisible unless something needed fixing. But then Dad looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, he looked ashamed. Real shame. Not defensive anger. Not excuses. Shame. And that changes people. Or at least, it can. We talked until almost 3 in the morning. Dad admitted Tyler had hidden losses for months. Approved reckless spending. Ignored supplier warnings. Mom apparently still believed things would turn around somehow. Tyler had already moved to Arizona after the pressure got too intense. Left Dad alone to deal with the collapse. That part hit him hardest. Not the money. The abandonment. Funny how people finally understand loyalty after losing it. Before I tell you what decision I made, I want to ask you something. Could you forgive someone who only appreciated you after they lost everything? Because I genuinely didn't know if I could. The next morning, I drove to Mercer Industrial for the first time in 6 months. The parking lot looked emptier. Weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt. Inside, the warehouse felt tired. Like the building itself knew something was ending. Lewis hugged me so hard I almost lost balance. A few employees actually clapped when they saw me. That part nearly wrecked me emotionally. Because I realized they hadn't stayed loyal to the company. They'd stayed loyal to me. Dad watched quietly from the office doorway. I spent 3 days reviewing finances. The truth was brutal. Mercer Industrial couldn't survive as it was. Too much debt. Too many damaged relationships. Too many lost contracts. But parts of it could still be saved. On the 4th day, Dad asked quietly, "So, are you coming back?" And that was the moment everything changed. Because I finally understood something about myself. I didn't want the company anymore. Not the way I used to. That dream belonged to the version of me who spent years begging for approval from people incapable of giving it. So I told Dad the truth. "I'll help stabilize things. But I'm not sacrificing my life for this place again." He nodded slowly. No argument. No manipulation. Just acceptance. And weirdly, that hurt more than fighting would've. Over the next 2 months, I helped restructure remaining operations. Negotiated debt settlements. Recovered supplier relationships. Reduced overhead enough to prevent bankruptcy. Dad sold part of the business eventually. The warehouse stayed open. Barely. But Mercer Industrial was never the same again. Neither were we. Tyler called me once after everything settled. He sounded embarrassed. "I didn't realize how much you were doing." I laughed quietly. "Yeah. I know." That was pretty much the whole conversation. Mom started calling more often after that. Not about business. Just life. Small things. Weather. Dinner recipes. Random memories from when I was little. I think guilt changes people too sometimes. Not perfectly, but enough to make silence uncomfortable. A year later, I bought a small house outside Denver. Nothing huge. But it has a garage workshop with old wooden shelves I built myself. Sometimes on quiet mornings, I drink coffee out there before work starts. And every now and then, I think about the warehouse radio playing old country songs at 5 a.m. while forklifts warmed up beside the loading dock. I used to think Mercer Industrial was my inheritance. It wasn't. The real inheritance was learning the difference between being needed and being valued. Those are not the same thing. And if you spend too long confusing them, people will happily let you destroy yourself trying to earn love that should have been given freely in the first place. That's my story. If this hit close to home for you, tell me in the comments. What's one moment that made you realize your worth too late, or just in time? And if you stayed until the end, thank you. I mean that. Because sometimes hearing someone else survive something painful makes our own scars feel a little lighter.